Welcome to another night of Late Nights with Lenin. Today we have Caleb Cain, and I first heard about Caleb Cain about 2 or 3 years ago when he was on Majority Report, and he has a very interesting story. Do you want to give a quick rundown of that, Caleb?
Yeah, basically, it is very relevant to what we're talking about. So I appreciate you bringing me on. So, I grew up in West Virginia. Growing up, I probably would have thought I was middle class, although looking back, it's probably like lower, upper lower class. I was raised by my great grandparents. They grew up in the Great Depression. I heard all those sorts of stories. And, I lived in like pretty decent situation. I knew a lot of people that didn't. It's like it was a precarious environment. Whenever you get out of school, you basically either go home and play video games, go play sports, go do something like that, extracurricular. And if you don't do extracurricular stuff and you don't get out of the house, or if you do get out of the house and you just go around partying and doing drugs and like skateboarding around town. So that's what we did growing up, riding our skateboards around, doing stuff like that. I get to my senior year in high school, and I was pretty much progressive, like normie, like Jon Stewart listening, like liberal progressive. And, I was against the war in Iraq and all that sort of stuff. And, the guidance counselor pulls me into the office. She asked me, what are you going to do? We got to get you ready for next year. What you going to do? And I said, well, I'm not going to go to school, because what am I going to study? And, I don't really want to join the military because what they're involved in. So I don't know. I'll figure something out. She said, no, Caleb, that's not what we mean. Like, you're going to be here next year. Like, you're not graduating. I'm like, why? And they're like, well, you haven't done any of your work. And so, I started talking with that person, opened up to her, and she helped me out a lot. I had like a mentor in my life. And fast forward, I graduate high school, like by the skin of my teeth.
Oh, wait, so did you graduate the same year or did you graduate the next year?
I like pulled through. So she set me up with a Spanish 1 online and the Spanish 2 I had to go to into the classroom because I had 8 credits I had to finish in 7 periods in a day. I got all of it done, which was remarkable for me. Not that I was stupid. I was like that kid that would, sleep through class, wake up when there was a creative writing assignment, ace it, get, top grade in the class within like 30 minutes of writing it, and then go back to sleep. And the teacher would be all pissed off about it. But I just didn't do anything.
I'm just curious, was it because you were bored? Was it because you had problems at home, depression, something else, like some sort of other underlying problem that was not solved? I'm just curious.
Yeah, well, basically all the above, So undiagnosed ADHD, depression, bad home life, bullied at school, bored, that goes in with the ADHD. You're not really challenged. Like if you don't make grades good enough to get put into the honors classes, then you're going to be bored. But you have to be able to do the work and have the motivation and respect authority enough. Oh. You have to have authority figures. Like you have to respect your teachers. Otherwise you're not going to want to do work for them, so all of that, coupled with me not doing anything. And I graduated by the skin of my teeth. And then I got accepted into this study abroad program. I found the study abroad program online, go to India and, study sustainability. But I couldn't get into it because it's through the University of Amherst. And I didn't have the grades to go to Amherst and get a scholarship. And I didn't have the money to pay for the program outright, the study abroad program, which is like looking back, it was like $3,000. It's not even that much money, So I basically, my guidance counselor told me, you go to this small community college, bring grades up, and Amherst is saying that they were telling me, we'll give you a scholarship if you bring grades up. Well, I went to that school and I just fell back into old habits. And looking back, I don't know, I couldn't understand why, or at the time I couldn't understand why, like, why can't I go to class now? Why can't I do everything that I was doing my senior year? And looking back, it's because I didn't have that, that authority figure in my life, which I respected and looked up to, the guidance counselor. And I was also, at the time back in high school, living with a friend. I moved out of my family house because I got in a big fight with them, moved in with my friend, and I had this like support structure around me, right? And I wasn't stressed every single day coming home from school. So I was able to do my work. Well, at college, I didn't have that. So I just started, sitting in the dorm room, playing video games, sleeping, not going to class, going out and partying, smoking pot, drinking, all the distractions. And I ended up having to drop out. And I ended up having to move all the way back home in West Virginia with my grandparents, with my grandfather, depressed because of that, like feeling like defeated because of that. And I just started going online, to just kill time and to not be depressed. And I would just go on YouTube. And eventually
hold on. So you just making sure what this thing that you searched for on YouTube was how to not be depressed or tips for dealing with depression, something kind of like that.
Well, at first I was just watching content. I would watch like gaming content or whatever, right?
I know, but what were you searching?
21 at the time. Yeah, well, no, I wasn't really searching for anything other than like, gaming content, and eventually one of the channels that did gaming content that I found did this guy named Athene Wins. He actually, it's ironically runs a cult now in Germany, but he had this video. It was, I know, right? It was called God is in the Neurons. And he basically explains neuroscience. So he goes through all this stuff. And so it is preluding what what you're alluding to is that it was self-help content. Yeah. So, I found this video. It's called God is in the Neurons. Right. And in the video, a lot of the video was like this, like pseudoscience BS, but part of it, he just explains basically neuroscience. Right. So he explains like neuroplasticity, the idea that you can retrain your brain, cognitive dissonance, the idea that you can have, when you have conflicting ideas in your head, it can cause you to overlook information or evidence for something. But the thing that stood out to me was the neuroplasticity. And that concept really stood out to me because, growing up.
What is neuroplasticity?
Neuroplasticity. So it's this idea in neuroscience that your brain is plastic. And what that means is, before in the past, they used to, people used to think that your brain basically, like if you didn't learn something when you were very young, then you weren't able to get those skills as rapidly later on, or at least that's how I think they understood it. But what the concept itself is that you can learn skills later on. Now, as you age, it's going to be harder to learn things, but that you can basically rewire your brain. So you can learn to get better at guitar. You can learn to get better at math. Like you can, if you put in the time and you put in the effort, you can basically rewire your brain. You can, rewire certain aspects about your mental health, for example, see where we're going with this. But that idea stood out to me because, I grew up in the lower classes, and in the lower classes, there's, in the Black community, they have this idea called crabs in a bucket. I don't know if you ever heard that. It's this idea that when one crab tries to crawl out of the bucket, when one crab tries to leave the hood or get out of poverty or do better for themselves, all the other crabs come around and grab them and pull them back in.
Okay. Go ahead. I'll leave.
No, because it's a real thing when you grow up in a lower class, because when I was lower class, when I was growing up around people, if you started to educate yourself, everybody else will look at you like, who do you think you are? Who do you think you are? You think you're better than us? You think you're going to leave? You think you're going to do this? No, you're going to be just like us. And it's like, I think that it is something that our society ends up helping reinforce on people. And I've noticed that people in upper classes, they're not teaching their kids that stuff. They're actively trying to teach their kids away from that stuff. And for me, it ended up putting me in a mindset where I thought that, so I can improve myself, because you learn about this neuroplasticity. You learn that, well, you're not always going to be in the same caste system in life. You can improve yourself. But, I would say now I have different feelings about this, but at the time, it just makes you want to climb the hierarchy. It makes you want to turn into a little Jordan Peterson lobster and try to climb up the hierarchy. And it's fucked up. It's like there's this book, Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance.
Oh my God, I hate that. Okay,
right.
Hold on. Can I just make 2 comments? Okay.
Yeah,
so the first thing is that in a way, it's not the crabs that are keeping you down. It is the society that is. Like, I mean, like there's so many different things. And the second thing is that the reason why a lot of people feel like the other crabs are keeping you down is because there is no knowledge or whatever knowledge we had of how to collect it, because you're not going to be able to fight the US Army all by yourself. You need the whole village to do it. And there is no, but people here are there is no knowledge of that, people having that knowledge to be able to fight that back, or even thinking about what is the problem. Like, those have been erased from the American education system. So they just don't know where to even begin. But
that's what the bucket is, you know.
Bucket?
When people, well, in this analogy, you know, because you'll hear right wingers use this analogy a lot, right?
Okay.
And they always focus on the crabs. You know, they're always like, yeah, there's damn crabs. But no one ever talks about the bucket. Like, why are the crabs in the bucket in the first place? Why is there a bucket? I mean, I come from those communities. I tell you that people do self-sabotage and sabotage one another, and they put in their, you know, they do that. But why are they doing that in the first place? Why is there a bucket in the first place? You know, I agree with you.
Exactly.
100%. Right. I agree 100%.
Okay. So hold on. So then you said, okay, so you were talking a little fast. So I want to backtrack a little bit. Then you mentioned how basically you saw these self-help ideas where they basically want you to be like a little Jordan Peterson. I can do his voice, but I just need some time. I'll do it by the end. So yeah, what he does is, okay, at first he seems innocuous, where it's like, okay, clean your room. Okay, everyone should clean their room. Why not? But it just, but ultimately what he is doing is it's a lazy way where you're blaming the powerless for the way society is, as opposed to changing society, right?
I would say, you know, honestly, I would say that Jordan Peterson's like little like motivational talks would be perfectly fine if there wasn't the damn bucket. You know, if it like, yeah, like you're right, Jordan, you should clean your room. The micro is an extension of the macro. Like,
oh God, that's a total nonsense.
Well, I mean, like, but it's true that like if you like think down on yourself all the time and you don't think you can like, you know, do better for yourself, then obviously you're not going to like do better for yourself. But right, like Jordan, it's like, we don't live in the 1950s. We're not all like white middle classers in the 1950s. It's like you can't like. There's a bucket now, Jordan. You know, but
there was always the bucket, though.
Well, there was, right? Well, that's why I specify white middle class.
I mean, even then, like what I guess is, and it's done on a lot of purpose. It's done on purpose. Is that people are so alienated that they can't even imagine some kind of. Like, first of all, they can't even imagine, oh, it is possible. People have done this before, but we can't do it by ourselves. We need to build this blah, blah, blah. And that kind of sequential thing, like people are too alienated to even imagine a different type of world, I guess. Yeah,
I would agree. I mean, yeah, I couldn't even imagine myself outside of this bucket scenario. Like I mean, when you start out, you think like, this is just the way it is. Like, this is just how it is. Like down here with the crabs, all the crabs together, don't even really see the bucket at all. You know, you just think this is the best that it gets, right? This is your life. Yeah, but later I heard that. Well, at least listening to your other interviews, it seems like you went into what's his name, the really nut Stefan Molyneux. Yeah. Yeah. So we're getting to that now where, and this is where like it honestly gets a lot darker. So, you know, it's one thing listening to like self-help content, and now you get into this like hierarchical, like ladder climbing attitude. That's one issue. But as I would watch the self-help content, I like put myself on this mission where I'm like, well, I'm going to fix myself. I'm going to fix my depression. I'm going to just rewire my depression. I'm just going to will myself to go to school. I'm going to get my engineering degree, and I'm going to get the hell out of this community. And I just started watching all sorts of self-help content. Some of it was like the cringe entrepreneurial stuff, you know, that led me to all sorts of different channels. But eventually it led me to a channel called Free Domain Radio, led by a man named Stefan Molyneux. And he had tons of philosophy content and self-help content, tons of it, thousands of episodes of podcasts. By the time I found this it was like 2013, 2014, somewhere around there. And, I would watch his stuff. I would listen to the self-help. He would have people call into his show. He would basically give them these like pseudo therapy sessions where he would it was really badass show. Like he would basically like psychoanalyze them.
Family, right? All the time.
Yeah. I mean, that was part of it, like it wasn't, there's a couple times where I think he did tell people outright to do that. I'm not sure, but what he would do is he would give you this framework of life, this really strict, tight framework. You have to live by these values. You have to live by these principles. You have to do these things. And he would never say, you need to do these things. He would always say, if you don't do these things, then basically hell on earth is going to erupt. Your life is going to fall apart. And you're going to end up right back in the traumatized. And you got to remember, a lot of people watching this show were people that came from traumatized families, were people that came from traumatized backgrounds. There are people growing up alienated in lower class or precarious middle class, communities. And they would call in, he'd be telling you this stuff and instantly your mind flashes back to all the worst times in your life. And you're like, well, I better listen to Steph, because if I don't listen to Steph, everything's going to fall apart. And these people would call into his show. He would psychoanalyze them. He would do all this stuff. And yeah, and part of the leaving your family is if you keep people in your life that don't have these values, that he extends this even to political beliefs. If you have people in your life that don't share these political beliefs, don't share these like moral philosophical beliefs, don't share basically his cult ideology, then don't you think that they might drag you down too? Don't you think they might be like one of those crabs in the bucket? And don't you want to get out of the bucket? I mean, that logically follows. And so, yeah, a lot of people cut their families off. You can read about it online. I mean, for me, cutting family off was no big deal. I already had like a really bad relationship with my family. That resonated. His upbringing, he had a rough upbringing. That resonated with me. Basically like everything about Steph, I saw myself. And so I kind of set him up as this parasocial authority figure. All of a sudden I almost through the video screen, I had that guidance counselor back in my life again, and, for a little bit, your life kind of does improve because you kind of force yourself. And, I went from laying in bed all day to going and getting a job. I got a girlfriend. I got a car. I did all these things. Life still never had stability. Life still was always this precarious, like, trying to claw up this bucket. But, from a certain subjective lens, I thought, oh, Steph is making my life better. Things are improving. And, so I started listening to other videos that he would do. And he would do interviews. He would do interviews with political figures, with like these, right-wing activists and stuff. And as he was engendering into me all of this like self-help stuff, which a lot of it honestly wasn't even negative, he would also insert political beliefs. So anti-feminism, like Red Scare style anti-communism, anti-Muslim, or xenophobic beliefs. Great Replacement. I learned about that from Steph.
Wait, what is the Great Replacement for people who may not be familiar?
Great Replacement is this. So they look at like demographic shifts that are occurring in the West and like Western countries. And then they say, so they'll show like birth rates amongst like whites are going down. They'll show like Muslim people are moving in, or Indian or Pakistani people are moving in, and they're having higher birth rates. But then they'll take that stuff and they'll frame this meta narrative, this story that, white people built the West, Europeans built the West. And if all these brown people move in with their sub IQs and their backwards cultures, then basically the West is going to fall. Western civilization will fall apart. And then you're going to be like, it's going to be like living in Pakistan.
Okay. That's funny because we're right now. So what he is taking advantage of is people's lack of knowledge of like how this entire imperialism system works. Yeah. And the reason why Pakistan is backwards is simply because it had been, I mean, the British had the entire cycle of imperialism where they go deindustrialize the country and then use it as a rack material extraction factory. So he's taking advantage of that ignorance of that whole cycle in order to just kind of say that the reason why Pakistan's backwards is because these people are inferior. Is that it?
Yeah. Yeah. It's old colonial attitudes, about race and culture updated with this sort of like imperialist dystopian propaganda, right? Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. So, I mean, I believe that stuff. I was never a white nationalist per se. Like I would never would identify that way or call myself a white nationalist. But, one thing I've learned, like looking at like, maybe you could call it a materialist view of the world. Maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but like,
no, you're right. Go ahead.
What you say is not always what you are. Even what you subjectively think about yourself is not always what you are. I might think, well, I'm just a American and a conservative. It's like, no, dude, you're a white nationalist. Like if you're a neo-fascist. If I write your beliefs down on a piece of paper and compare and contrast, like, people they prefer to subjectively label themselves. So, yeah, I mean, I don't know, Asha. I mean, we could talk about that experience more, but it was basically, and there's an element of like, liberals like to hyper focus on this, but there is an element of the YouTube algorithm, feeding more and more content across your way. Really, that's really just because right wingers were there to use the algorithm.
Well, I mean,
there to take advantage of it, but
they're funded they have lots of money. So then they can just like throw a lot of crap at and see what sticks. Yeah. But yes, liberals want to focus on everything besides what is wrong with society that we can fix, because they like status quo ultimately.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think the most important parts of that story are, I do meet people that don't come from precarious backgrounds, and they literally, they're very absorbed by like narratives. And so like, they'll see like discrepancies in like a mainstream liberal narrative. And then they'll see like conservatives will come in, they'll like, pry that gap in the narrative apart and be like, well, see, I guess they're wrong, so we're right. You see that happen. But a lot of people that fall into these movements, it's lack of community, precarious, material and emotional situations, a lot of trauma in their lives from the past. And yeah, these people like Molyneux, they come in, and Molyneux really is like, out of all these like right-wing, far-right figures, he is really one of the most insidious ones because of like the cult-like indoctrination he does and the isolation that he does and the sort of like strict belief system he puts into you.
Yeah. I guess for me, actually, we might want to do something slightly different. Because for me, I think the most important thing is that it is more like the lens in which we use to study the world. And a lot of times the right wingers or whatever already use what we call, what do you call it? Okay, so this is different than what everyone else thinks, like idealism, which is basically you look at the world the way it is, and you're not actually trying to discover what's the problems of the world, but you're just trying to keep the hierarchy the way it is. And left wingers, even in America, do like basically a lot of idealism, because in the U.S. for like the past, because of the Cold War, whatnot, they've just made it illegal to study the world in a, I kid you not, like study the world in a dialectical, materialistic way. And dialectical materialism is the opposite in that, just give me 1 second. I'm going to find the piece that I think you're going to enjoy more than the one I had. Okay. Hold on. I think I don't know. I know you're going to understand this.
Yeah, no, I did read the Lenin piece you sent, and like, man, people always tell people like, you should read Marx. You should read Marx. Honestly, I don't know why people tell people to read Marx. Like, that's just a bunch of boring crap that like,
Lenin's great.
People should just tell people to read Lenin. Like
that's
that.
What I do. Okay.
I was reading through it. I was like, this makes so much more sense to try to figure out labor theory of value and all this crap about capitalism and all this stuff.
Oh yeah, Lenin's great.
This is like way more down to earth.
Okay, so yeah, no, Lenin writes for literally illiterate peasants. So do you want to we can do that piece or another piece that I think you can handle. Let's actually do the one I sent. Do you want to read that? We've already read sections 1 and 2 with Kami Trucker, but yes, absolutely right. You should definitely. Marx is very good, but he's not Lenin. Is all I'm going to say.
Well, no, it's like heavy theory crap.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to start with section 3. Riches. Poverty.
I have it pulled up here.
Okay, excellent. Section 3, it starts with riches, poverty, property owners, and workers in the countryside.
The section 3, riches and poverty, property owners, and workers in the countryside. We know now what the Social Democrats want. They want to fight the whole of the rich class to free the people from poverty. In our countryside, there is no less and perhaps even more poverty than there is in the towns. We should not speak here about how great the poverty in the countryside is. Every worker who has been in the country and every peasant are well acquainted with want, hunger, and ruin in the countryside. But the peasant does not know the cause of his distress, hunger, and destitution, or how to rid himself of this want. To know this, one must first find out what causes all want and poverty in both town and countryside. Mm-hmm. We've already dealt, and feel free to interrupt if you want to make commentary or go down a line on this. Where are we at here?
No. Yeah, no, I'm saying that, this is exactly what we're saying is that the peasant does not know that, especially in the modern US, people who are in the rural areas often don't feel distress, destitution, hunger, poverty, but they don't actually have or understand how to get rid of it. And he's still right.
I want to say this thing that I've been thinking about lately. We were talking about what you are idealistically versus what you are materially, what the world is idealistically versus what it is materially. And I kind of have this goofy theory that, setting aside the racism or whatever prejudices or any of that stuff, right? A lot of rural, conservative, even Republicans, when they bitch about communism, they're bitching about capitalism.
Oh, yeah. Oh, 100% of the time.
And when they talk about what they, and especially when I was reading the first 2 parts of this, where Lenin's he's basically I was a little bit surprised. Even as much time as I spent around lefties, well, actually it makes sense. As much time as I spent around Western lefties, I never knew that Lenin talked this much about America and the projects that were going on in America with liberty and all these things. A lot of the conservatives, I would even go as far to say
collection of all the things that Lenin so far spoken about America. It's very thick.
Yeah. Well, it almost seems like they looked at all the social democratic movements or all the revolutions and movements in the West. And they were those are things that we want to learn from. And those are things that we want to pick up from. And also, I didn't realize how, I knew they had a Tsar in Russia, but I didn't realize that they kind of speed ran democracy in their country. All the other countries already had basically democratic systems, and Lenin's coming in and is no, we got a king and we really need to do something
exactly.
They speed ran it the whole way.
Yep, that's exactly what happened. And what you realize, you're absolutely right. And Lenin was right too, but I forgot.
Yeah, but basically my whole thing is the conservatives, they're kind of communists. They're this.
Yeah, no. Okay, this is what I say that. Okay, so when I'm speaking to a conservative, I don't see the conservative is not denying reality. They just, they kind of get reality. They just don't have a very good say on what fixes it. They'll come out with the most insane thing.
Yeah.
Like Rand Paul or whatever. But liberals are just very comfortable in where they are, and they actively deny reality, which is gets on your nerves. Joe Biden is less corrupt than Trump because something. And so in fact, it is much easier to teach conservatives dialectical materialism because they are not that bad with analyzing what's wrong. They just don't understand how to get there. So I agree with you.
They've been propagandized. Okay, I'll get back into this. So, we've already dealt with this briefly, and we have seen that the poor peasants and rural workers must unite with the urban workers. But that is not enough. We must also find out what sort of people in the countryside will follow the rich, the property owners, and what sort of people will follow the workers, the social democrats. We must find out whether there are many peasants who, no less than the landlords, are able to acquire capital and live on the labor of others. Unless we get to the bottom of this matter, no amount of talking about poverty will be of any use. And the rural poor will not know who in the countryside must unite among themselves with the urban workers, or what must be done to make a dependable union and to prevent the peasant from being hoodwinked by its own kind, the rich peasant, as well as by the landlord. To get to the bottom of this, let us now see how strong the landlords are and how rich the peasants are in the countryside. Let us begin with the landlords. We can judge of their strength in the first place by the amount of land they own as a private property. The total amount of land in European Russia, including peasant allotment land and privately owned land, has been calculated at about 240 million. And how do you say that word? I was trying
Desatines.
Desatines.
It's like a little more than an acre is what I tell people.
240 million desatines, except the state lands of which we shall speak separately. Out of this 240 million desatines, 131 million desatines of allotment land are held by the peasants. That is to say, by over 10 million households, whereas 109 million desatines are held by private owners, i.e. by less than 500,000 families. Thus, even if we take the average, every peasant holds 13 desatines, while every family of private owners owns 218 desatines. But the distribution of the land is much more unequal, as we shall presently see.
Okay, so he starts out with like what it looks like when you just put it on the paper. And it's actually, if you see it, if you do the same exact calculation for your state, and all of this is public records in the US, you'll see that it'll follow the same phenomenon where essentially what happens is that the big landlords just keep gorging eventually, and they keep squeezing out everyone else. But what to me is important is the method in which he calculated this, because we're poor. I can't hire Reuters or what other polling company is there, Pew or something, to go do land surveys. So we have to look at what's available and kind of estimate from what's available. So yeah, let's continue.
Of the 109 million desatines owned by private owners, 7 million are royal demesnes. In other words, the private property of the members of the imperial family. The Tsar, with his family, is the first landlord, the biggest landowner in Russia. One family possesses more land than 500,000 peasant families. Furthermore, the churches and monasteries own about 6 million desatines of land. Our priests preach frugality and abstinence to the peasants, but they themselves, by fair means and foul, accumulated an enormous amount of land. And further, about 2 million desatines are owned by the cities and towns, and an equal amount by various commercial and industrial companies and corporations. 92 million desatines, the exact figure is 91,605,845, but to simplify the matters, we'll quote round figures, belong to less than 500,000 families of private owners. Half of these families are quite small owners, owning less than 10 desatines of land each, and all of them together own less than 1 million desatines. On the other hand, 16,000 families own over 1,000 desatines each, and the total land owned by them amounts to 65 million desatines. What vast areas of land are concentrated in the hands of the big landowners is also to be seen in the fact that just under 1,000 families own more than 10,000 desatines each. And altogether, they own 27 million desatines. 1,000 families own about as much land as is owned by 2 million peasant families.
So this is amazing how, if you look at the way, even modern land is in the US, it's more or less, like if you change the families to corporations, it's more or less the same exact distribution, in that you have like 1,000 families, or in the US, like a few corporations owning all the land more than almost everyone else combined. And what to me, it gets to is the nature of with capitalism. If you have capital, you can keep accumulating. So no matter what the original land distribution is, if you let it run for long enough, it'll always end up like being like a pyramid, in my opinion.
Where are we at here?
Obviously, millions.
Yeah. Obviously, millions and tens of millions of people are bound to live in poverty and starvation and will go on living in poverty and starvation as long as such vast areas of land are owned by a few thousand of the rich. Obviously, the state authorities, the government itself, even the Tsar's government, will always dance to the tune of these big landowners.
I like that. Hold on. I really like this. The state authorities, the government itself will always dance to the tune of these big landowners. And this is basically what, instead of landowners, if we change it to corporations, that's exactly what both parties are doing in Washington.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so these landowners back then, were they capitalist? Was it a capitalist system or a feudal system?
Both. I mean, in the cities, it was capitalism. In the countries, it was feudalism. And so agriculture was very primitive. So yeah, these landowners were held large estates where they just kind of got, I guess, tributes from like everyone else labored and gave them like their tributes. And that's how they kept on getting larger and larger.
Yeah. Okay.
At this point.
We'll always dance to the tune of the big land. Obviously, the royal poor can expect no help from anyone or from any quarter until they unite, combine into a single class to wage a stubborn, desperate struggle against the landlord class.
I think this is true in America as it was in Russia, in that, yes, the rural poor cannot expect help from anyone until they unite and combine to wage a stubborn struggle. And this time, instead of the landlord class, we can just say the corporate class.
How do you feel about the idea that we're moving out of capitalism and into feudalism, that capitalism's like dying?
We probably are in certain ways. I mean, as more and more capital accumulates, suddenly the corporations are having a lot of land holdings. Then what you get is that they'll have the company store is coming back. And then you'll go from being a wage worker to, in the feudal system, you would like work on, quote unquote, work on your own and give them you would like work the land, and it was kind of like a gig not that different from a gig economy, in that you then gave like a percentage of your earnings to your landlord. So yeah, it is inevitable to be, if accumulation happens to this levels again, we're definitely moving there.
Yeah. Okay, so at this point, we must observe that very many people in this country, including even many people of education, have a totally wrong idea about the strength of the landlord class. They say that the state owns much more land. And yeah, when I started reading this, I was like, oh, this is like what you see like motherfuckers be doing around playing with numbers nowadays. Yep. Because I read through this prior. So, okay, so they go on to talk about the state owns much more land than is thought. These bad counselors, they say that the state owns much more land than the private holdings. These bad counselors of the peasants say a large portion of the territory, i.e. all of the land of Russia, already belongs to the state. Now, these words are taken from the newspaper.
Let me do the Russian one.
Yeah, you do the
Revolutionaya Rossiya. Okay.
Thank you. The mistake these people make arises from the following. They have heard that the state owns 150 million desatines of land in European Russia. That is true. But they forget that these 150 million desatines consist almost entirely of uncultivatable land and forests in the far north, in the Archangel, Vologda, Olenets, Vyaka, and Perm. You guys say that.
They're like states.
Gubernas. Thus, desatines consist. What?
That's the state.
Okay, that's the state. Okay. Thus the state. You're right. Thus, the state has retained only that land which, up to the present, has been quite unfit for cultivation. The cultivatable land owned by the state amounts to less than 4 million desatines. And these cultivatable state lands, for example, in Samara and Gubernera, where they are particularly extensive, are leased for very low rents for next to nothing to the rich. And the rich lease thousands and tens of thousands of descatines of these lands and then sublet them to the peasants at exorbitant rates.
This reminds me a lot of how U.S. Like the entire mortgage crisis, like the banks did lots of land at like really low rates, and then they turned back and they gave, what do you call it, subprime low rates to normal people.
Yeah, absolutely. The people who say that the state owns a great deal of land are very bad counselors of the peasant. The actual case is that the big private landowners, including the Tsar personally, own a lot of good land. And the state itself is in the hands of these big landowners. As long as the rural poor fail to unite and by uniting become a formidable force, the state will always remain the obedient servant of the landlord class. There is another thing that must not be forgotten. Formerly, almost all of the landlords were nobles. The nobility still owns a vast amount of land. In 1877 to 78, 115,000 nobles owned 73 million descatines of land. But today's money, capital has become the ruling power. Merchants and well-to-do peasants have bought very large amounts of land. It is estimated that in the course of 30 years, from 1863 to 92, the nobility sold more than they bought, land to the value of over 600 million rubles. And the merchants and honorary citizens have acquired land to the value of 250 million rubles. Peasants, Cossacks, and other rural inhabitants, as our government calls the common folk to distinguish them from the gentry and the clean public, have acquired land to the value of 300 million rubles. Thus, on the average, every year, the peasants in the whole of Russia acquire land as private property to the value of 10 million rubles. And so there are different sorts of peasants. Some live in poverty and starvation, others grow rich. Consequently, the number of rich peasants who incline toward the landlords and will take okay, I want to say something here. So like one thing I thought about when I was reading a lot of this is like, so, you know, I just grew up in a rural area where you have like, there's like kind of like business, like we probably call them the rich peasants. But like, I'm kind of wondering how much even those people, like, I don't know, it seems like even those people are getting squeezed out pretty hard now.
Oh, they will. Okay, what you'll see is that this happens every time with capitalism, is that when the really like the super rich like acquire, what'll happen is that first they'll bankrupt the kind of poor people. And then eventually what Lenin calls is the middle peasants, they'll bifurcate into two parts where you'll have 90% of them will become poor and maybe 10% of them will elevate. So yeah, eventually, if this keeps going, yeah, those who are what you call middle class are definitely going to be squeezed out. And it's funny because in 1917, he does, like, in the end, the middle peasants do join him because they do kind of realize, oh, okay, this is what's going on. We used to be this way, and things have been getting worse and worse as like the rich like consolidate more and more wealth. So he's right, and you're right. And you'll notice this, like, if you read a little, like, this is still from 1903. So if you read like the next 10 years of data, you'll see exactly what you're saying is going to happen.
And so there are different sorts of peasants. Some live in poverty and starvation, others grow rich. Consequently, the number of peasants who incline towards the landlords will take the side of the rich against the workers is increasing. The rural poor who want to unite with the urban workers must carefully ponder over this and find out whether there are many rich peasants of this kind, how strong they are, and what kind of union we need to fight this force. We've just mentioned the bad counselors of the peasant. Those bad counselors are fond of saying that the peasants already have such a union. That union is in the Mur, the village commune.
Okay,
commune. Go ahead.
It's kind of like a village. Like, you know how in America you have a city council? The Mir is kind of like a village council, except the councilors were kind of appointed based on how big their estates were. Okay, go ahead.
So is that, I still don't understand what that is. Is that like okay,
so let's say that you have a city council. In New York City, we have a city council, right? every village in Russia had a village mayor, where whoever was the head of the marshal of the gubernia was like the head of the mayor in order to deal with the village affairs. And it was based on how much land they owned is how many seats they got in the council, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. So the mir, they say, is a great force. The mir unites the peasants very closely. The organization of the peasants is the mir colossal. That is wrong. It's a tale. A tale invented by very kind-hearted people, but a tale nonetheless. And if we listen to tales, we shall only wreck our cause and the cause of uniting the rural poor with the urban workers. Let every rural inhabitant look round carefully. Is the unity of the mir, is the peasant commune at all like the union of the poor to fight all the rich, all of those who live on the labor of others? No, it's not, and it cannot be. In every village, in every commune, there are many farm laborers, many impoverished peasants, and there are rich peasants who employ farm laborers and buy land in perpetuity. These rich peasants are also members of the commune, and it is they who lord it in the commune because they are a force. But do we need a union to which the rich belong? And which is lorded over by the rich? Of course not. We need a union to fight the rich. And so the unity of the mir is no good to us at all. What we need is a voluntary union, a union only of people who have realized that they must unite with the urban workers. The village commune, however, is not a voluntary union. It is enforced by the state. The village commune does not consist of people who work for the rich and who want to unite to fight the rich. The village commune consists of all sorts of people, not because they want to be in it, but because their parents lived on the same land and worked for the same landlord, and because the authorities have registered them as members of that commune. The poor peasant are not free to leave the commune. They are not free to accept in the commune a man whom the police have registered in another volust, but whom we may need for our union in a particular village. No, we need a very different kind of union. A voluntary union consisting only of laborers and poor peasants to fight all of those who live on the labor of others. The times when the mir was a force have long passed, never to return. The mir was a force when hardly any of the peasants were farm laborers or workers wandering over the length and breadth of Russia in search of a job, when there were hardly any rich peasants, when all were equally ground down by the feudal landlords. But now the money has become the principal power. Members of the same commune will now fight one another for money like wild beasts. The moneyed peasants sometimes oppress and fleece their fellow peasants more than the landlords do. So that would be okay.
So by landlords, he means hereditary landlords, like hereditary gentry. And after the official quote unquote feudalism was abolished, not only did you have the hereditary gentry itself had the land, but then there was a second kind of like merchants who could just like pay money and buy a lot of land. And those landlords were sometimes, they were like much worse than they were what you know as the kulaks or whatever. They would have usurious land. And so, they were sometimes way more oppressive than anything the hereditary gentry could dream of.
Okay. What we need today is not the unity of the mir, but a union against the power of money, against the rule of capital, a union of all the rural laborers and of all the poor peasants of different communes, a union of all the rural poor with the urban workers to fight both the landlords and the rich peasants. We have seen how strong the landlords are. We must now see whether there are many rich peasants and how strong they are. We estimate the strength of the landlords by the size of their estates, by the amount of land they own. The landlords are free to dispose of their land, free to buy land and sell it. And that is why it's possible to judge their strength very accurately by the amount of land they own. The peasants, however, still lack the right to freely dispose of their land. They are still semi-serfs tied to the village commune. Hence, the strength of the rich peasants cannot be judged by the amount of allotment land they hold. The rich peasants do not grow rich on their allotments. They buy a considerable amount of land, buying both in perpetuity as their private property and for a number of years on lease. They buy both from the landlords and from their fellow peasants, from those peasants who leave the land, who are compelled by want to let their holdings. It will therefore be more correct to divide the rich, middle, and poor peasants according to the number of horses they own. I felt okay. I was like, wow, this is like a time in history here, right?
No. This is actually very important. Like people don't understand. So in order to cultivate your land, if you do not have a draft animal, like this is way before, what would happen is that you as a human being alone can't cultivate a draft animal's worth of land. But like that's what's supposed to be an acre is what a horse can cultivate within like one day or something like that. And so what would happen is that in 1861, Russia, quote unquote, abolished serfdom and everyone allegedly got a little piece of land, but not everyone had draft animals, which are like horses, cows, anything that can pull a plow. And so these, what would happen is that people who owned the draft animals would then rent out their draft animals to extremely usurious rates. But and then they would like foreclose upon their land and they would be like, okay, so in order for you to borrow my horse, I don't know, to till your land, you're going to have to give me this much grain and this much interest. Yeah. And eventually it became untenable and they would foreclose upon that land and that person would have nothing. And so the amount of horses is the amount of, means of production that you had in that time. And so that's why Lenin, and Lenin's right, because then eventually those with lots of horses will be able to charge super high interest rates and foreclose upon everyone else who didn't have anything on their land.
Is there anything you would make that comparison? Like, what would you compare to horses now? I mean, most people don't even have any sort of means of production like that, right? They just they have their home and their car and their bank account. I mean, is there anything, did you hear that, Asha? Is there anything that you would, like, what would you compare the livestock to today?
Well, today, for example, if you're like a small business loan or anything like, I mean, even today in many farms, in many countries, like tractors or any kind of rental thing, like usurious rentals. So let's see. Like those, you know how you have those like rent to own things? Those are probably kind of like how expensive they were. Yeah.
Okay. A peasant who owns many horses will nearly always be a rich peasant. If he keeps many drought animals, it shows that he cultivates a lot of land, owns land besides his communal allotment, and has money saved up. Moreover, we are in a position to calculate the number of peasants owning many horses in the whole of Russia, European Russia exclusive of Siberia and the Caucasus. Of course, it must not be forgotten that we can speak of the whole of Russia only in averages. The different, what you want to read? Well,
yes, there's like a county and gubernia is like a state.
Yeah. Russia only in averages, the different uyezds and gubernarias vary to a considerable degree. For instance, in the neighborhood of cities, we often find rich peasant farmers who keep very few horses. And some of them engage in market gardening, a profitable business. Others keep few horses, but many cows and sell milk. In all parts of Russia, there are also peasants who do not make money out of the land, but engage in trade. They run creameries, hulling mills, and other enterprises. Everybody who lives in the country very well knows of rich peasants in his own village or district. But we want to know how many there are in the whole of Russia and how strong they are, so that the poor peasant shall not have to guess and go about blindfold, as it were, but know exactly his friends and his foes. Well, then, let us see whether there are many peasants who are rich or poor in horses. We've already said that the total number of peasant households in Russia is estimated about 10 million. Between them, they now own probably about 15 million horses. About 14 years ago, the number was 17 million, but it's smaller now. Thus, on the average, every 10 households have 15 horses. But the whole point is that some of them, a few, own many horses, while others, very many, own no horses or very few. There are at least 3 million peasants who own no horses, and about 3.5 million own one horse each. And all of these are either utterly ruined or very poor peasants. We call these the rural poor. They number 6.5 million out of a total of 10 million. That is to say, almost 2/3. Next come the middle peasants who own a pair of drought animals each. These peasants own about 2 million. These peasants number about 2 million households, owning about 4 million horses. And then come the rich peasants, each of whom owns more than one pair of drought animals. Such compromise 1.5 million households, but they own 7.5 million horses. And thus 1/6 of the total households own half the number of horses.
Yep. That sounds familiar about everything.
Mm-hmm.
In America, like a horse, like it doesn't even matter what you use. Everything is about that. Like this kind of, it's kind of like the same curve, no matter what you measure.
Now that we know this, we are in a position to judge fairly accurately the strength of the rich peasants. In number, they are very few. In the different communes and volas, they will comprise 10 to 20 households in every 100. But these few households are the richest. Taking Russia as a whole, they own almost as many horses as all the other peasants taken together. That means their land under crops must also amount to nearly half the total areas sown to crops by the peasants. Such peasants harvest much more grain than they require for their families. They sell large quantities of grain. They grow grain not merely to feed themselves, but grow it chiefly for sale to make money. Peasants like these can save money. They deposit it in savings banks and banks. They buy land as property. We have already said how much land the peasants all over Russia buy every year. Nearly all this land goes to these few rich peasants. The royal poor have to think not of buying land, but of getting enough to eat. Often they have not enough money to buy grain, let alone land. Therefore, the banks in general and the peasants' banks in particular do not help all peasants to buy land, as is sometimes asserted by people who try to deceive the
muzik is like the country folk.
The mozaik, or by the very simple-minded, but only an insignificant number of peasants, only the rich peasants. Therefore, the peasants' evil counselors, whom we have mentioned, tell an untruth when they say that the land is being bought by the peasants, that it is passing from capital to labor. The land can never pass to labor, that is, to the poor working man, because the land has to be paid for with money. But the poor never have any money to spare. The land can only go to the rich, moneyed peasants, to capital, to those people against whom the rural poor must fight in alliance with the urban workers. The rich peasants not only buy land in perpetuity, most often they take land for a number of years on lease. By renting large plots, they prevent the rural poor from getting land. For example, it's been calculated how much land rich peasants have rented in a single uzyet.
It's like a single district. Yeah. And this one is called Konstantinograd in Poltava gubernia, which is in the west area. We'll put up a map. Okay, go on.
And what do we find? The number who rented 30 destines or more per household is very small. Only 2 out of every 15 households. But these rich peasants have gained possession of 1/2 of all the rented land, and each of them has on the average 75 destines of the rented land. Or take Tarita Gubernia, where a calculation has been made of how much of the land rented by the peasants from the state through the mir, through the village commune, has been grabbed by the rich. It has been found that the rich, who account for only 1/5 of the total number of households, have grabbed 3/4 of the rented land. Everywhere, land goes to those who have money, and only the few rich have money. Further, much land is now let by the peasants themselves. The peasants abandon their holdings because they have no livestock, no seed, nothing with which to run their farms. And today, even land is of no use unless you have money. For instance, and that's like something that that's like, when I read this, I'm like, well, damn, these peasants had it pretty good. They had a horse and they had dirt and they had like something to plant their crops in. But like this point that he makes that today, even land is of no use unless you have money. Well, today, like there is no means of production. You don't have a horse. You don't have a plot of land. You have to completely rely upon money.
Exactly. And so at one point, the peasants did have like enough to like sustain themselves, like technically. But as capitalism developed, what they started to do is instead of making land to feed themselves, like they started to grow crops for profit. Like it didn't matter who it fed as long as it could profit. And so, yeah, that's exactly what happened. And our current system is like 100 years later, where you have most of the rural things automated. And now instead of, I mean, we could make it so that the rural lands are there to feed everyone in America, but they don't. They're merely doing it for profit, and it's ancillary if we happen to feed ourselves. So yeah. This is absolutely right.
So where am I at here? For instance, and Nova, you got to do the Russian.
Okay, hold on. Let me give me 1 second. Where am I? Okay, for instance, in Novozhyansk Uzyed in Samara Gubernia, that's where Lenin was born. Oh, okay.
1, sometimes even 2 out of every 3 rich peasant households, rich peasant house holds rent allotment in their own or even in another commune. Mm-hmm. The allotments are let by those who have no horses or only 1 horse. In Taurida Gubernia, as much as 1/3 of all peasant households let their allotments. 1/4 of all the peasant allotments, 250,000 dessatines are let. Of this 250,000 dessatines, 150,000 dessatines, 3/5, are rented by rich peasants. This too shows whether the unity of the mir, the commune, is of any use to the poor. In the village commune, he who has money has power. And what we need is the unity of the poor of all communes. You want to break down that last part? So it says this too shows whether the unity of the mir, the commune is where what was it? It was
that's right.
Well, they were talking about. I think I understand.
No, I hear it. Let me explain. So in 1861, they had basically, what do you call it? They abolished feudalism, and everyone was given a little bit of an allotment land. Yeah. But the condition was that they had to work on that land and so on. And if they worked so hard and gotten so many rubles, then they could like redeem that allotment land and own title to that. But of course, that would never happen because there's no amount of work you could actually work to earn your allotment land because it was just too ridiculously high. And so what they noticed is that people out of desperation started to just like rent their allotment land to richer people who then, what do you call it? What do they do to it? Who then like combined it together and
consolidate it?
Yeah, consolidate it and grow large scale agriculture. And so then, of course, the way the village mir is consisted is that the more land you own, the more power you got. So ultimately it ended up squeezing the poor serf, slaveholder, whatever you want, serf or whatever, like the involuntary laborer down more and more until they didn't really have much. And so but then when when the Tsarist officials were like talking to the village poor, they're like, yeah, you don't need a political party or anything. We have the village mir to represent you. But of course, the village mir is not representing you. And Lenin's kind of like explaining how, like, if you were to go to somebody in rural West Virginia, you'd be talking about how both parties are not representing you. Like, this is more or less what Lenin's trying to tell them. Okay. Go ahead.
So just as with the land purchase, the peasants are deceived by talk about buying cheap plows, harvesters, and all sorts of improved implements. Walmart.
Yes.
Zemsto stores. Well, I guess now Amazon. Zemsto stores.
Oh my God. Zemsto stores are exactly like Walmart. Oh my God. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
And artels are set up, and it is said improved implements will better the conditions of the peasantry. That is mere deception. I'm sorry, just picturing all these like Russian peasants in their like poor clothes going down to the local Walmart. Jesus Christ, nothing's new, huh?
Yeah.
This is mere deception. All these improved implements always go to the rich. The poor get next to nothing. They cannot think of buying plows and harvesters. They have enough to do to keep body and soul together. All this sort of helping the peasants is nothing but helping the rich. And as for the mass of the poor, who have neither land, livestock, nor reserves, they will not benefit by the fact that the better implements will be cheaper.
Yep.
Here's an example. In Samara Gubernia, all of the improved implements belonging to the poor and to the rich peasants have been taken stock of. It was found that 1/5 of all households, i.e., the most well-to-do, owned about 3/4 of the improved implements. So let me reread that. It said that 1/5 of all households owned about 3/4 of the improved implements, while the poor, half the households, only had 1/30. Jesus. Out of the total of 28,000 households, 10,000 possessed one horse. Each or none. These 10,000 had only 7 improved implements out of a total of 5,724 improved implements owned by all the peasant households in the UZ.
So 10,000 of these peasants only were able to get 7 improved implements, and everything else went to the rich.
Yeah, that's not even proportional. That's just
nothing.
That's sad.
Yeah.
Okay.
7.
So where are we at?
7 out.
7 out of 507. 7 out of 5,724. That is the share of the rural poor in all these farm improvements. In all this increase in the number of plows and harvesters, which are supposed to help all the peasantry. That is what the rural poor must expect from those who talk about improving peasant farming. Finally, one of the main features of the rich peasants is that they hire farmhands and day laborers. Like the landlords, the rich peasants also live in the labor of others. Like the landlords, they grow rich because the mass of the peasants are ruined and pauperized. Like the landlords, they try to squeeze as much work as they can out of their farmhands and pay them as little as possible. If millions of peasants were not utterly ruined and compelled to go to work for others, become hired laborers, sell their labor power, the rich peasants could not exist, could not carry on their farms. There would be no abandoned allotments for them to pick up and no laborers for them to hire. The 1.5 million rich peasants throughout Russia certainly hire no less than 1 million farmhands and day laborers. Obviously, in the great struggle between the property class and the class of the propertyless, between masters and workers, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, the rich peasants will take the side of the property owners against the working class. We now know that the position and the strength of the rich peasantry. Let us examine the conditions of the rural poor. We've already said that the rural poor comprise the vast majority, almost 2/3 of the peasant households throughout Russia. To begin with, the number of households without horses cannot be less than 3 million. Probably more than that today, perhaps 3.5 million. Every famine year, every crop failure ruins tens of thousands of farms. The population grows, life on the land becomes more crowded, but all the best land has been grabbed by the landlords and the rich peasants. And so every year, more and more people are ruined, go to the towns and the factories, take work as farmhands, or become unskilled laborers. A peasant who has no horse is one who has become quite poor. He's a proletarian. He gains a living, if you can call it that. If you can call it living, it would be truer to say that he just contrives to keep his body and soul together. Yeah. Not from the land, but from his farm, but from working for hire. He is brother to the town worker. Even land is of no use to the peasant without a horse. Half the households without horses let their allotments, while some even surrender them to the commune for nothing, and sometimes even pay the difference between the taxes and the expected income of the land. Because they are not in a position to till their land. A peasant who has no horses sows 1 desatine, or 2 at the most. He always has to buy additional grain if he has the money to buy it with. His own crop will never suffice to feed him. Peasants who own one, well, how'd they buy the extra grain?
They then at least go to a kulak who then charges exorbitant interest, and then they foreclose upon them and take everything they own eventually.
Oh, great. And then they got to move to the city.
Yep.
Oh, great. Because the city's so great to live in.
Then they'll work in the factory. Same thing continues going.
Right. Where peasants who own 1 horse each, and there are about 3.5 million such households throughout Russia, are not very much better off. Of course, there are exceptions, and we've already said that here and there. There are peasants with 1 horse each who are doing middling or even rich. But we're not speaking of exceptions, of individual localities, but of Russia as a whole. If we take the entire mass of peasants who have one horse each, there can be no doubt that there are a mass of paupers. Even in the agricultural gubernias, the peasant who has one horse sows only 3 or 4 dessatines, rarely 5. His crop does not suffice either. Even in the good year, his food is no better than that of a peasant without a horse, which means that he is always underfed, always starves. His farm is in decay. His livestock is poor and short of fodder, and he is not in position to look after his land properly. The peasant who owns one horse
in Voronezh gubernia,
for instance, can afford to spend, not counting expenditure on fodder, not more than 20 rubles a year on the whole of his farm. A rich peasant spends 10 times as much. 20 rubles a year for rent to buy livestock, repair his wooden plow and other implements, pay the shepherd, and for everything else. Do you call that farming? It's sheer misery, hard labor, endless drudgery. It is natural that some of the peasants with one horse each, and not a few, should also let their allotments. Each land is of little use to a pauper. He has no money, and his land does not even provide him with enough to eat, let alone with money. But money is needed for everything, for food, for clothing, for the farm, and to pay tax. How'd they get this land? Because I'm sitting here like, damn, these peasants got more than I do.
Okay, so remember there was serfdom, and in 1861, when serfdom was abolished, the Tsar kind of said, okay, you are entitled to this square of allotment land. But then there were 2 things. The first thing is that they were given the crappiest lands because the landlords took all the good lands. And then the second thing is that with the allotment land, they were not given any of these other implements. So they basically had to go to a kulak and say, hey, I need a plow. And then he's like, oh, you need a plow? Okay. You're going to give me 1/3 of everything you're going to grain. And then he would do that. And then like the kulak would like foreclose upon that land. It's like, hey, this is my land. And so on and so forth.
Right. And then we head back to the prior.
So this is towards the end of exactly.
Right. Okay. So where we at throughout Russia? Exceptions, even a good year for rich peasant. 20 rubles a year for rent by lot. No, we already read all that. He has no money, and his land does not even provide him with enough to eat, let alone with money. But money is needed for everything, for food, for clothing, for the farm, and to pay taxes. And you have to read that one again. I haven't got that one quite. Voronezh gubernia.
In Voronezh gubernia.
Voronezh gubernia. A peasant who owns one horse. A peasant who owns one horse usually has to pay about 18 rubles a year in taxes alone, while he cannot make more than 75 rubles a year to meet all his expenses. Under these circumstances, it is sheer mockery to talk about buying land, about improved implements, about agricultural banks. Those things were not invented for the poor. Where is the peasant to get the money from? He has to look for earnings on the side. A peasant who owns one horse, like the peasant who owns none, ekes out a living only with the help of earnings. But what does earnings mean? It means working for others, working for hire. It means that the peasant who owns one horse has half ceased to be an independent farmer and has become a hireling, a proletarian. That is why such peasants are called semi-proletarians. They too are brothers to the town workers because they too are fleeced in every way by all sorts of employers. They too have no way out, no salvation, except by uniting with the Social Democrats to fight all the rich, all the property owners. Who works on the building of railways? Who is fleeced by the contractors? Who goes out lumbering and timber floating? Who works as farmhand or as day laborer? Who does the unskilled work in the towns and ports? It is always the rural poor, the peasants who have no horses or only one each. It is always the rural proletarians and semi-proletarians. And what vast numbers of these there are in Russia. It has been calculated that throughout Russia, exclusive of the Caucasus and Siberia, why does he keep excluding the Caucasus?
Because he doesn't have statistics, basically.
8 and sometimes even 9 million passports are taken out yearly. Those are all for migratory workers. They are peasants only in name. Actually, they are hirelings, wage laborers. They must all unite in one union with the town workers, and every ray of light and knowledge that reaches the countryside will strengthen and consolidate this unity. There is one more point about earnings that must not be forgotten. All kinds of officials and people who think as the officials do are fond of saying that the peasant, the muzhik, needs two things: land, but not very much of it. Besides, he cannot get much because the rich have grabbed it all, and earnings. Therefore, they say, in order to help the people, it is necessary to introduce more trades in the rural districts to provide more earnings. Such talk is sheer hypocrisy. For the poor, earnings means wage labor. To provide earnings for the peasant means transforming him into a wage laborer. Fine sort of assistance this is. For the rich peasants, there are other kinds of earnings, which require capital, for instance, the building of a flour mill or some other plant, the purchase of a threshing machines, trade, and so on. To confuse the earnings of moneyed people with the wage labor of the poor means deceiving the poor. Of course, this deception is to the advantage of the rich. It is to their advantage to make it appear that all kinds of earnings are open to and with reach of all the peasants. But he who really cares for the welfare of the poor will tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth. He's borrowing from America there, right? That's like, that's Anglo speak. It remains for us to consider the middle peasants. We have already seen that on the average, taking Russia as a whole, we must regard as the middle peasant one who has a pair of drought animals, and that out of a total of 10 million households, there are about 2 million middle peasants households in the country. The middle peasant stands between the rich and the rich peasant and the proletarian. And that is why he is called a middle peasant. His standard of living, too, is middling. In a good year, he makes ends meet on his farm, but poverty is always knocking at the door. He has either very few savings or none at all. And that is why his farm is in a precarious position. He finds it hard to get money. Only very seldom can he make as much money out of his farm as he needs. And if he does, it is just barely enough. To go out for earnings would mean neglecting the farm, and everything would go to rack and ruin. Nevertheless, many of the middle peasants cannot get along without earnings. They too have to hire themselves to others. One compels them to go into bondage to the landlord, to fall into debt. And once in debt, the middle peasant is hardly ever able to get out of it. For unlike the rich peasant, he has no steady income. Therefore, once he falls into debt, it is as if he had put his neck in a halter. He remains a debtor until he is utterly ruined. It is chiefly the middle peasant who falls into bondage to the landlord, because for work paid on a job basis, the landlord needs a peasant who is not ruined, one who owns a pair of horses and all implements required in farming. It is not easy for the middle peasants to go elsewhere in search of earnings. So he goes into bondage to the landlord in return for grain, permission to use pasture land, the lease of the cut off lands, and the money advances during the winter. The middle peasant is hard pressed, not only by the landlord in the kulak, but also by his rich neighbor, who is always one jump ahead when he wants to acquire more land and never misses an opportunity to squeeze him in some way or the other. Such is the life of the middle peasant. He is neither fish nor fowl. He can neither be a real master nor a worker. All the middle peasants strive to become masters. They want to be property owners, but very few succeed. There are very few who even hire farm hands or day laborers to become rich on the labor of others, to rise to wealth on the backs of others. But most middle peasants have no money to hire laborers. In fact, they have to hire themselves out. Wherever a struggle begins between the rich and the poor, between the property owners and the workers, the middle peasant remains in between, not knowing which side to take. The rich call him to their side. You too are a master, a man of property, they say to him. You have nothing to do with the penniless workers. But the workers say, the rich will cheat and fleece you. And there's no other salvation for you but to help us in our fight against the rich. This struggle for the middle peasant is going on everywhere, in all countries, wherever the social democratic workers are fighting to emancipate the working people. In Russia, the struggle is just beginning. And this is why we must most we must most carefully study the matter and understand clearly the deceits the rich resort to in order to win over the middle peasant. We must learn how to expose these deceits and keep the middle peasant to find his real friends. If the Russian Social Democrat workers at once take the right road, we shall establish a firm alliance between the rural workers and the urban workers more quickly than our comrades, the German workers, and we shall speedily achieve victory over all the enemies of the working people.
I see that. Okay. So what my first comment is that, yeah, even in America, it's often that I guess the Republicans are always talk about the middle class, which is not that different from the middle peasants in how precarious they are and how quickly everything can just fall apart for them. But it seems like those seems to be very identical. Like, what do you think?
Can you say that again?
I'm saying that, like, okay, so here he talks about how things are so precarious for the middle peasant that they can barely hang on, and just like one bad year, one bad drought, everything falls apart. I think the American middle class that the Republicans and Democrats talk about are also in such an equally precarious position where it's like literally like one bad event and everything falls apart.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know quite how to articulate this because it's something I'm still thinking about. I think that we're not facing the same situation, and that we're going back to the comment I made earlier. I think we're facing more of like a feudal arrangement in our future, and that's what we're fighting against in the future. But I mean, the middle class situation's there, right? Like everything's like the hill's sliding down, and yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. And yeah, that's who people appease to. The other thing that stood out to me, or what I think about is Democrats obviously, but what are social democrats or what are leftists doing to appease to the rural poor
in America?
Yeah, in America.
Absolutely nothing, because they are not, most of them don't even know what the problems the rural poor face. Like, no. I haven't seen them go there, go collect and talk to them, collect statistics, understand what's going on. And so a lot of them just don't understand. Like, you can't really talk to the rural poor if you don't understand what the problems they are facing, like whether it's be their water or if it's like no jobs or whether or not there are thousands of problems. And unfortunately, we don't actually have people talking to them because it is hard work. And it also, I guess, people do need to be out there figuring out. I mean, and you can't, of course, rely on whatever statistics, because statistics can be manipulatable. So you do have to be on the ground, just kind of talking to people and understanding what's going on.
Yeah, well, it seems like, and this is like kind of getting like into different territory, but like, you gotta remember, like, I'm new to all this stuff. So I don't quite, I've pieced a lot of this together for myself for the past couple of years, but like, it seemed at some point there was like this, like all the leftists, like all the social democrats went to university and they got this like bourgeois education. And then they kind of just look at the people, the rural poor, so to speak, the people that Lenin's talking about here. Those are the unwashed masses. Those are the reactionaries. Those are the racists and they're just the dirt. Again, it's ironic that those people in the rural poor are more communist, like in a sense.
No, I agree with you on 100%. Yeah. Yes. I call that projection, but you're absolutely right. It's mostly because they don't want to outreach to them and they don't want to actually solve the problems. By the way, I have a question now. You have a YouTube channel. Like, do you have any other plans, I guess, so besides your YouTube channel?
I don't know what to do. Like I'm like, again, like coming from like being like this poor kid in West Virginia, I got thrusted into a position that I haven't had a lot of guidance on, and I don't always know like what direction to take things. My interests lie in sort of media theory and communications and like understanding, I think a lot about propaganda. I think a lot about how people are manipulated through social media algorithms, online, through the media, through the news, through the fiction that they watch on TV. And, so that's where my interests lie. That's like the ways in which, I'm probably interested in Lenin, right? Because, the guy was a propagandist, that's one of
no, he was actually really good at dissecting capitalist propaganda. So
right.
I can send you more things about like how like what he dissected. So are you working on any projects on your YouTube channel, or are you just kind of letting it low then?
So right now on the YouTube channel, I'm working on a show called Limited Hangout. And it's basically like, touching a little bit on what we talked about with the left. I think the left has been totally like recuperated into capitalism. Mm-hmm. And I think that like, it really frustrates me. I'm just going to say this and people can take it however they want.
Go right ahead.
I find a lot of times that fascists sound more like communists than American leftists.
Okay, yeah.
Fascists, do you know what I mean by that?
I know exactly what you mean, because fascists are, like I said, they understand, they have a dialectical understanding of what is going on in the world. It's just that they don't want to solve the problem. They just kind of want to keep them down. So you are 110% right. Most of the American left are definitely in denial. Not even in denial. They just don't understand. They're not like even trying to engage with reality. They don't understand what the role of imperialism is and why is the world the way it is, because they're not curious. So you're absolutely right. And it's a hard problem. I would suggest it's a very hard problem is all I have to say, because there is a lot to be concerned about with regard. There's no left on top of it. There is no, even magazines like Jacobin, they're just not doing their job. I mean, they're not even offering, like they can't even offer a good coherent analysis of everything because they're so into respectability. So you're absolutely right on this.
Yeah, I have found that like I'll watch these it's funny, like a lot of these ideas like coming back to communism, I found it because I was doing research, because when I left the alt-right rabbit hole or whatever, I was just a little like, I don't even want to say social democrat at this point because that word's been so like abused.
Yeah, no one knows what anything is. Right,
but like, a liberal. I just became like a progressive, a socially progressive liberal again, right? Mm-hmm. And during the Biden election, I really fucking struggled with that. Everybody was like, vote for Biden. I was like, I don't trust these people. I don't want to vote for these people. But it was like, it was through watching like far right fascist YouTubers that I started learning about dialectical materialism. I started learning about what Marx actually said, because they've got a whole cadre of these motherfuckers over here on FashTube. I won't drop names. People can always contact me if they want to like look stuff up. But they delve into like postmodern literature. They delve into what Marx and Lenin were talking about. They delve into all this.
Can you send me some? So maybe I can debunk them because.
Yeah, I'll send you some stuff. Now, again, they're exactly as you say. They have a sort of a dialectical understanding. I wouldn't say they completely do. They have a sort of a dialectical understanding of reality. And then they sort of like inject their like idealism into that.
Yep. And that's because they want to keep the hierarchy the way it is or make it worse. And that's, you know what, maybe in the next few weeks, if there's a video, I'm really bad at staying on topic. So if you like send me a video or two, maybe you and I can like deconstruct a video or two.
Yeah, I'd be happy to, because I could kind of like, I could help you like go through the narrative, the canon of what they're saying. And then you could probably like actually pick up on the theory of it. Right. But like, it's really sad. I have to say this. It's sad that I learned more about theory, so to speak, by listening to FashTubers than I did by watching BreadTubers. Oh no, BreadTubers really suck really badly because they're all from the West and they have no clue what they're talking about. So yeah, let's actually plan for this. How about you and I, after we hang up, I'll contact you on Discord. You send me a few videos. And we can definitely have like some kind of like in the next couple of weeks, we can do 2 or 3 videos together where we deconstruct this. Yeah, I'd love to do that. So, I mean, for me, a lot of what I'm working on the channel is I have this show, Limited Hangout, where I'm trying to get on, like actual dissidents. On the right, they're calling themselves the dissident right. And when I look around, I'm like, there's no dissident left. There's just no dissident left. And so I don't know
what a dissident left would be, but I would say that somebody who is, at least who's going to try to understand what is wrong with the world as it is.
Right. So, I want to see like those ideas come to YouTube more, I want to see like, and there's a lot of speakers out there. There's a lot of figures that have been talking about this stuff. And you can even find some of these people on YouTube. They don't get brought onto these channels. I mean, you don't see Vosh interviewing these people. You don't see, you don't see activists.
The worst. Vosh is I'm like, he's so right wing. I mean,
yeah, I just call them the Coomer left.
Oh, that's funny. I like that Coomer left. Like the boomer, like it's like a Zoomer boomer.
Yeah, but they just want socialism so they can coom. They don't.
Oh no, yeah, exactly. They don't even like Wash. Oh my God, Wash is okay.
If you look at like a lot of that's another thing that's happened to the left, and I think it's this like sort of like, middle class. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, no.
Exactly. It's like the middle classification, but it's where like a lot of these people, they kind of just want like this hedonistic, comfortable, like lifestyle where they like live in a Marvel movie or something.
Exactly. You got it. Okay. Well, let us know what your channel is. And
So it's Faraday Speaks. Also, I'm working on writing a book right now about my experiences. So that's the other thing I've got in the works.
Okay, cool. I heard you were featured on Caleb Maupin.
Okay, can I just address that?
Go for it.
Okay, Caleb Maupin I did not know who that person was. I used to watch his videos
you were lucky.
Bit. I used to watch his videos a little bit because it would come up on my RT stuff, and I was coming out of the alt-right, and I was starting to look at left-wing media, and I wouldn't understand what he was talking about. He's walking around, he's talking about China, he's talking about this.
No one doesn't understand what he's
like. This guy's interesting, but I don't understand what he's like actually.
Yeah, well, like I said, no one understands what he's talking about.
Right. And so, fast forward, I start like, I get asked to. I host the Destiny versus non-compete debate because I saw them two fighting online. I'm like, well, these people should not be fighting, like they should be talking. That turns into a total shit show. And after that, people start like messaging me. They're like, you should host more debates. You were so good, blah, 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 blah. I hate debates now.
Me too. I hate debates. Yeah. Debates should be banned. Okay.
But I thought, okay. And someone said, you should have Caleb Maupin come on and have him debate Destiny. And I'm like, all right, sure. I've heard of Caleb before. He seems decent. I'll have him come on. He comes on and like, he monologues at Destiny the whole time. Like, I remember Destiny even did a video afterwards, and like Caleb talked for 70% of the conversation. And then afterwards, he was like, Destiny talked over me the whole time. And this was all bullshit. And this was all rude. And I'm like, I was just sitting there like a moderator, like, what the, and the whole time he had all these like people in the chat, like shilling his book and shit. It felt really weird.
Yeah. It's a very like, I think there's something really weird going on with his like organization. But I do remember, let me see if I can find it. I could not, it was so boring. I could not read his book, but you were definitely in it. Like, give me 1 second. Okay.
You have that book?
Yeah.
Oh my God. I kind of want to copy that book. But
I can send it to you. I'll send it to you right after. Okay. Let me see what he says about you. I do remember he said something about you.
So just to like fill in the rest of the background, like, before you get into that, because so I host that debate with Destiny and I'm kind of like just baffled by the whole thing. I'm like, okay, that was weird. And then afterwards, I start making videos where I'm kind of like, struggling with like my political positions in videos and he would come and comment on my videos and be like, if Caleb Cain would just, this is so sad to watch a liberal flounder like this. If he could really just like come to communism and he would have like it was just like, it felt like really culty the way he acted towards me.
Yeah,
it was like this like distant, like almost like weird, like grooming thing. And I'm like, why don't you just send me a DM? You want to talk to me? Just send me a DM, like this is weird. And I just kind of ignored him because I just felt I got really weird vibes off him. It's not necessarily anything he believed or anything. I just got weird vibes.
No, you were right to get weird vibes off of him.
Yeah. And then fast forward, I don't, nothing else, I have no other contact with this person. And then this book gets released.
Yeah.
And I'll let you, let
me see what he says. Caleb Cain was made temporarily famous by a New York Times article published on June 8th, 2019. The article is featured on the New York Times website with an intricate graphic and text that sounds almost like a movie trailer. Caleb Cain was a college dropout. Looking for direction, he turned to YouTube. Soon he was pulled into the far right universe, watching thousands and thousands of videos filled with conspiracy theories, misogyny, and racism. I was brainwashed. The article seems on its surface to be a telling story of how an impressionable young man can be seduced by the extremism and become a violent radical. The article opens with an account of him buying his first firearm. However, actual details of Caleb Cain's stories are quite disappointing.
Which, by the way, I didn't write the damn article. Okay, I can't control how they paint up a story and all this stuff. That's got nothing to do with me.
Okay, let's look at that. Okay, Caleb Cain was a young man in West Virginia who had grown up in a conservative Christian family, but became more liberal as he matured. According to his own account, he dropped out of college following some psychological problems and began supporting himself by working at a warehouse. While working at the warehouse, he had lots of time to listen to YouTube videos and soon became a regular listener to Stefan Molyneux. Stefan is the anarcho-capitalist internet guru who is known to flirt with the misogynist and racist ideas amid his overall libertarian perspective. After listening to Molyneux regularly, he also consumed content from other racist and far-right commentators. Cain's story may be more compelling if from there he had become Caleb Cain's story might be more compelling if from there he had become a terrorist or committed hate crimes.
It's like you didn't blow anybody up. I guess your story doesn't matter, bud. Go fuck yourself.
Stops there. New York Times narration has one expecting that Cain became a suicide bomber or a mass shooter or joined armed attempts to overthrow the government. However, he did none of this. What kind of... Oh my God, I'm sorry. This is so stupid. Okay. This is the extent of Cain's brainwashing, was listening regularly to right-wing voices online.
Okay, and if we want to take this as criticism of the New York Times, if it just ended there and it's like, and so the New York Times is hyperbolizing stories, I'd be like, okay, fair enough. Okay. But it goes on.
Yeah, let me read it. Okay. Cain eventually shifted his political views. A new girlfriend who had a more compassionate worldview and his changing life circumstances enabled him to de-radicalize and unbrainwash himself. Yet in Cain's interviews, he speaks as if he is repenting from the heaviest of sins. In one interview, he says with deep regret that at one point he considered going to the Charlottesville protests in 2017, but decided not to.
All right, so here, I have to stop you. All right. The girlfriend I had at the time was a Christian conservative. She wasn't into like weird political stuff, but she did not pull me away from the far right. We broke up like before I even really we broke up at the time that I found Destiny videos. So had nothing to do with that. Second thing, I didn't even know about Charlottesville until as it was happening. I didn't have the money to go there. I was within distance of it. I never talked about going to Charlottesville. I don't know where he made that up. That's just like, and this is a theme throughout this, like getting all this shit inaccurate. Continue, please.
Okay. After the advertising of the New York Times article, Cain launched his own YouTube channel, Faraday Speaks, celebrating his status as a former extremist who had been de-radicalized. However, the extent of Cain's radicalism was nothing more than listening to YouTube videos, becoming more and more distant with his family, and at one point considering going to a demonstration, but deciding not to do so. Cain has collaborated with Destiny in efforts to combat extremism that sucked him in. He has done interviews about how to deprogram one's friends and relatives. But what exactly are they being deprogrammed from? Listening to videos online, having political views that change with the new romantic relationship, considering maybe going to a demonstration. Caleb Cain has made clear in interviews that he advocates for social media to censor and remove ideas he considers to be conspiracy theories in order to prevent others from being brainwashed as he was. Caleb Cain's emergence as a minor figure in the BreadTube universe, initiated and promoted by mainstream media voices like Destiny and ContraPoints, is almost comical. The nature of BreadTube as a poorly executed de-radicalization effort by the most powerful factions among the imperialists has made quite apparent.
Okay, so let's go through that again. So ContraPoints, Natalie commented on my first video saying, so thank you for making this heart. and she followed me on Twitter. And I DM'd her once saying, hey, I got like racist, like threatening to dox me. What do I do? And she's like, I don't know. They already know where I live. Nothing's ever happened. That's the only correspondence I've ever had with her. She does not reach out to me. Furthermore, Destiny, like in a way cares about like people like being outright, but he's not on some crusade. He was never on some crusade de-radicalization mission. So like, it's like this conspiracy. It's like weird, like conspiracy that like Caleb has constructed around like Natalie doesn't even want to be involved in the D-Rad thing. She doesn't even like, she got drunk one night and tweeted out. She was like, I'm tired of these boys saying I'm the witch in the woods to set them back on their hero's journey. Stop fucking messaging me. It's like essentially what she said. So it's like Caleb's got this really weird idea that Caleb was at the end of that. Okay. Caleb also goes on to talk about Dr. Stephen Hassan.
I don't even know who that is.
Okay. So you should read that section because that's another part that's relevant to this.
Okay. One figure who is definitely not part of the BreadTube universe, but certainly lurks in the background of the discussion about deprogram is the psychologist Dr. Stephen Hassan. Over the course of many decades, Hassan has carved out for himself the position as America's leading cult expert. His books on what he called cult mind control are widely circulated, and he appears on CNN, MSNBC, and other TV outlets as experts on the topic of brainwashing. As a 19-year-old, Stephen Hassan was recruited into the Unification Church, Moonies. This was an anti-communist religious cult imported into the United States by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agencies to work against the growth of communist organizations on college campuses. In the 1970s, many young people were involved in protesting the Vietnam War and in support of Black liberation. College campuses were a hotbed of recruitment for the Revolutionary Union, now the Revolutionary Communist Party. Youth Against War and Fascism, youth wing of Workers' World Party, the Young Workers' Liberation League, now the Young Communist League, and the youth wing of the Communist Party USA, and other anti-imperialist and revolutionary organizations. The Unification Church, a strange religious sect that worshipped a Korean pastor named Sun Myung Moon, had begun rapidly expanding in the United States during the 1970s. The group believed Moon was the new Messiah and sent to Earth to unify the Christians of the world in a global crusade against communism. Moon's cult had started in coordination with Korean intelligence as a way of deprogramming Marxist political prisoners and student activists. The Moonies became infamous for their predatory nature. They financially exploited members and demanded they hand over all their positions and spend each waking hour as unpaid laborers raising funds for the group. Stephen Hassan admits that the cult he had spent roughly 2 years as an active member was set up by the American intelligence. In his appearance of the podcast of Jordan Harbinger, he said, post-World War II Korean War, South Korea was very unstable. In North Korea is a version of what it is today. Some people in military intelligence in the United States decided, well, the North Koreans are brainwashing. We need to create a program in South Korea to stabilize the regime. They taught the South Korean president, you need to set up a Korean CIA will help you. They set up a re-education program for dissidents in South Korea, and they decided to use a front person, so it was not looking like a government operation, and it was the Moonies that were chosen to do it. The Moonies had, nobody knows why or how, the patents for manufacturing M16 rifles or other American military hardware. Why? Because America was leaving Vietnam. Still the height of the Cold War, we have to stop the commies. And then somebody said, let's bring the Moonies to the United States and set up a counter-communist programs on college campuses. And that's where I got recruited. I got sent to fast for Nixon during the Watergate because God loves Nixon. God wants Nixon. The United States government has never acknowledged the existence of these things. They don't want to talk about it. As a young man rising up the ranks of the Moonies, Hassan eventually got into a car accident, and in the hospital, his parents were able to lure him away from the group to their home, where he was successfully deprogrammed by other former members. Eventually, Hassan got involved with the Cult Awareness Network, an organization run by Ted Patrick. Hassan worked with Patrick's organization, which charged a lot of money to families for the service of kidnapping relatives believed to be in the Moonies or other groups labeled as cults. Affiliates of the Cult Awareness Network are widely accused of having held these young legal adults against their will and deprogrammed them. Individuals who were deprogrammed by Patrick and his associates often testified that the deprogramming session involved brutal interrogation, sleep deprivation, the very techniques that cults were accused of using. Hassan has admitted that he was. Wait, is there a point to how when he'll tie it back to you?
Yeah, we keep like this kind of goes on. So yeah.
Okay, hold on. I'll read then. Involved in involuntary deprogrammings, but has not gone into detail about this. Ted Patrick was convicted of kidnapping and false imprisonment in the 1980 after he and other members of the Cult Awareness Network, the organization which Steve Hassan was affiliated, he kidnapped a 26-year-old waitress in Tucson, Arizona. Kidnapping and false imprisonment are both very serious crimes. But Patrick only received a year in prison and a $5,000 fine. Patrick also faced charges in latter years after he kidnapped an Amish woman whose husband disapproved of her joining a more liberal sect. These charges were ultimately dropped. The Cult Awareness Network was eventually shut down in 1995 after a jury ruled that Jason Scott had his civil liberties and religious freedoms violated when a Cain affiliate, Rick Ross, kidnapped him and attempted to deprogram him. Cain was ordered to pay $1 million to Scott and ultimately went bankrupt. Accounts from these various individuals describe Hassan as being directly involved in the kidnappings. An individual named Arthur Rosell put forward a signed affidavit describing Hassan's method. Rosell said he was forcibly kidnapped by several men, imprisoned, hands and feet bound with his hands tied behind his back so tightly that they were badly swollen and the color of a bruise. Deprived of sleep for 3 days, he was not allowed to shave or wash and denied all privacy even when using the toilet. Hassan subjected him to methods when the victims later described as brainwashing and mind control techniques. Hassan even threatened him with drugs if he did not recant his religious beliefs. Rosell describes the experience, saying he felt like a captured animal in a zoo. In his most recent books, Hassan denounced kidnappings and forced deprogrammings, but he does not directly address most of the allegations about what he is alleged to have done with the Cult Awareness Network. One would think that Hassan would be discredited due to his involvement in an organization that was widely reputed to have been involved in criminal activities. Hassan not only avoided prosecution, but frequently appears on mainstream US television as a cult expert. In a book titled, Hassan composed a book entitled The Cult of Trump in 2019, declaring that the US president was very much like Reverend Sun Myung Moon and had brainwashed his supporters with hypnotic mind control methods. Hassan made the headlines in January of 2021 after an appearance on CNN in an aftermath of the events on Capitol Hill. Hassan said, "So in studying all the thought reform brainwashing models, I developed a VITE model of authoritarian control. It basically talks about the controlling behavior, information, thoughts, and emotions to create a new identity that's dependent and obedient. And this is a radical personality change in the mental health literature. In APA DSM-5, it's called dissociative disorder and questioning of identity. On the bottom line is all of America needs deprogramming because we've all been negatively influenced by Donald Trump." Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez echoed his calls for deprogramming. I see now. Hassan has been a mentor to Cain, and according to an unnamed source, appears to be advising other members of the BreadTube community in their efforts to de-radicalize Americans on the far right. Is any of this true?
Okay, so this is like this really caught my eye, the Dr. Hassan stuff. So I've talked to Dr. Hassan a couple times, I became aware of Dr. Hassan because when I got de-radicalized, and this is where Caleb actually could have built like a really spooky case against me if he had actually done research, but he did like no research into me. So when I got dragged out of the far right, or whenever I, left or whatever, and became public on New York Times, all these people, and mostly through Twitter, but then, I'd get emails too, people in this, it's called the countering violent extremism industry. This was an industry, it's called CVE. This is an industry that was set up during the war on terror, basically de-radicalize Muslims. I pretty much disavow this industry at this point. It's really problematic. It's basically like, it's this idea that you can de-radicalize people away from, but really what it is, it's trying to depoliticize a political issue.
Okay.
You understand? That's what de-radicalization is. It's like, we can use psychological models. We can use all these different things to like, basically. And if Caleb had actually been doing his research, he could have read a much spookier book. I feel like I should write a book. Like,
you should.
I should write the same book, but just better.
Yeah.
But like, he's basically, so I became aware of Dr. Hassan because of some of the anti-cult activists and researchers in that, milieu of people. Dr. Hassan is like struggling. Dr. Hassan is not seen as the top cult expert. Dr. Hassan gets pulled on the news whenever they need to like pull somebody on to like confirm their narrative. But Dr. Hassan is not like doing well. Now, all that shit he did in his past, I disavow that shit. That's awful. And I think he does too at this point. But Caleb is trying to construct this narrative that Dr. Hassan is like, tied closely to me, which the whole, he mentors me is I basically like, I interviewed Dr. Hassan once on my YouTube channel. I've talked to Dr. Hassan 2 times after that. While he was on the YouTube channel, I must have said something to him like, you're like a mentor to me, like when you say that to somebody, and he's like, he is mentoring Caleb Cain. And then the bread tuber thing, I think that his anonymous source is me. I think that he's using a quote that I said to then reinforce. I swear that's what he's doing there, because I don't know. Maybe there was another bread tuber that was like, emailed Dr. Hassan for like advice on a script. But I can tell you, Dr. Hassan doesn't give a crap about BreadTube. He doesn't give a crap about socialism. He doesn't care about communism. He doesn't care necessarily about capitalism. Dr. Hassan is like trying to like help people in QAnon currently, if you go look at what he's doing. So it's like Caleb has built up this weird conspiracy theory about BreadTube. And it's probably because he read way too much Lyndon LaRouche. It's like,
I don't even know who Lyndon LaRouche. I kind of know who he is.
Lyndon LaRouche was like, he was a communist, but he was this guy that basically like in the same way. I know he has
a weird cult that, yeah.
Yeah, but in the same way that we think of conspiracy theories being associated with the far right now, Lyndon LaRouche engaged in that sort of thing. And like, I get it. CIA does fucky shit all the time. And like, there's all sorts of like, deep state activity going on all the time. I understand that. But like Caleb like tries to make these like convenient. It's almost like he's trying to make this convenient conspiracy theory. BreadTube does aid imperialism. That's
because they're kind of dumb. And if you don't really think much and just kind of regurgitate articles, you're going to do it. Yeah.
There's an analysis here to show how their ideology is filtered down, but it's not because the CIA bankrolls Vosh.
No, it's because they're dumb.
I know. And Caleb just has to turn it into, I read all that. I was like, what are you talking about?
Yeah. Like, it's just, I tried reading it and it was so boring. And I was like, and now he's like, ever since he attacked the CPUSA, it was insane, where he's like threatening to sue them and stuff. Like he blocked me, but I'm like,
he blocked me too.
Oh, okay. Well,
he blocked me once he started writing that article or that book or whatever you want to call it.
Okay. Anyways, so okay.
That's a weird way to end it, but I know you probably have to go. But like that.
No, it's fine. It's kind of funny because well, okay. So, but can you just tell people you can find him on YouTube. You can find him. Just to text. Can you just like send me all the links that you want me to put on?
Yeah, you can find me on YouTube at Faraday Speaks. I'm doing a show there called This Limited Hangout. You can also find me on Twitter at Faraday Speaks. And I do sort of like personal videos where I talk about my own experiences. I do short video essays, and then I do the Dislimited Hangout show. And hopefully,
by the way,
coming out.
This just in, Janet, if you're there, we're gonna just show this really funny thing that we just got Lenin to tweet. Janet, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay. And then before Caleb leaves, because it's kind of funny. And this, I was not in charge of this. Like Matt did it on his own. And I don't know, it somehow like he had been mentally connected to this.
Yeah.
I don't know how, but Matt did this on his own without me. And it's weird how he did it. Like at the same time, we must have had a telepathic connection.
Okay.
This is really funny because this is an account we manage called Lenin Tweets. And my friend Matt did this like spontaneously with that somehow. And he's like, Maupin unites all whom ideological decay steer, who are not concerned with the defense of Marxism, all Philistines who do not understand the reasons for the struggle and who do not wish to learn, think, and discover the ideological roots of the divergence of views.
What's he saying?
Maupin is saying, I have spent all my life organizing against blah, 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 blah. And he's like crying about somebody being mean to him on Twitter. It was just funny that
how does that person not know how to play politics? Like I just don't get it. Like
he just like cries about how people are mean all the time. Anyways, it was great hanging out with you, and keep after tomorrow I will reach out on Discord so that we can see if we can collaborate for any of these videos. Okay?
Yeah, I'd love to. There's a lot we could look for.
Okay. Привет. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Asha. Bye-bye.
Chapter 2, In Exile, 1898 to 1901. I went out to Minusинsk at my own expense, accompanied by my mother. We arrived in Krasnoyarsk on the 1st of May in 1898, whence we had to go up the Yenisei by boat. Navigation, however, had not started yet. In Krasnoyarsk, I made the acquaintance of the Narodopravец Tyutchev and his wife, who, being experienced people in these matters, arranged a meeting for me with a party of Social Democrat exiles who were passing through Krasnoyarsk. Among them were two comrades, Legnik and Sylvan, who had been charged with me in the same case. The soldiers brought the exiles down to be photographed and sat a little way off, munching the bread and sausage with which we had treated them. In Minusинsk, I went to see Arkady Tukrov, one of the first marchers banished permanently to Siberia, to give him regards from his sister, an old school friend of mine. I also went to see Felix Kohn, the Polish comrade who had been sentenced to penal servitude in 1885 in connection with the proletariat case and had a very hard time in prison and exile. He had for me the aura of an old intransigent, and I liked him tremendously. It was dusk when we arrived in Shushenskaya, where Vladimir Ilyich lived. He was out hunting. We unloaded and we were shown into the cottage. In the Minusинsk district of Siberia, the peasants live in very clean log-built cottages. The floors are covered with bright home-woven carpet strips, and the walls are whitewashed and decorated with branches of Siberian fir. Vladimir Ilyitch's room, though small, was spotlessly clean. My mother and I were given the rest of the cottage. Our landlord's family and all the neighbors crowded in and looked over us and questioned us with great curiosity. At last, Vladimir Ilyich returned from the hunt. He was surprised to see a light in his room. The landlord told him that Oscar Enberg, an exiled St. Petersburg worker, had come in drunk and thrown all his books about. Ilyich ran up the steps. Just then, I came out on the porch and we met. We had a good long talk that night. There were only two other exiles in Shushenskoye, both workers. One was a social democrat Prominsky, a Polish hat maker from Łódź with a wife and 6 children. The other was a Putilov worker named Oskar Enberg, of Finnish nationality. Both were very good comrades. Prominsky was a calm, steady man with a firm character. He read and knew little, but his class instinct was strikingly developed. His attitude towards his wife, then still a religious woman, was one of tolerant amusement. He was very good at singing Polish revolutionary songs such as Ludu Roboczy, Raznach Swój Si, Pierwszy Maj, and others. The children joined in the chorus, and so did Vladimir Ilyich, who sang a lot in Siberia and obviously enjoyed it. Prominsky also sang Russian revolutionary songs, which Vladimir Ilyich had taught him. Prominsky planned to go back to Poland to work and slaughtered a little army of hares to make fur coats for the children. He never got back to Poland, though. He just moved a bit nearer to Krasnoyarsk with his family and got a job there on the railway. The children grew up. He became a communist. His wife turned communist too, and so did the children. One of them was killed in the war. Another barely escaped with his life during the Civil War and is now in Chita. Prominsky did not leave for Poland until 1923, but he died on the way from typhus. The other worker, Oscar, was of a different type altogether. He was a young man who had been deported for taking part in a strike and behaving violently in the course of it. He had read a lot of all sorts, but only had the faintest idea about socialism. He came back from the trip to the Volist once and said, "A new clerk has arrived and he and I have the same convictions." "Meaning?" said I. "We are both against the revolution," he answered. Vladimir Ilyich and I were flabbergasted. The next day I sat down with him to study the Communist Manifesto. I had to translate it from the German, and when that was mastered, we passed on to the capital. During one of our lessons, Prominsky came in and sat puffing at his pipe. I asked Oscar a question in connection with what we had been reading, but he could not answer it. Prominsky answered it for him with a calm, smiling ease. Oscar dropped his lesson for a whole week after that. He was a good fellow, though. There were no other political exiles in Shushenskoye. Vladimir Ilyich said he had tried to strike up acquaintance with the school teacher, but nothing had come of it. The teacher was drawn towards the local aristocracy, that is, the priest and a couple of shopkeepers. Their only pastime was playing cards and drinking. The teacher had no interest in whatever social problems. Prominsky's eldest son, Leopold, who was already socialist-minded, was always arguing with him. Vladimir Ilyich had a peasant acquaintance of his whom he was very fond of. He was Zhurlavyov, a consumptive man of about 30. This Zhurlavyov had formerly been a village clerk. Vladimir Ilyich called him a revolutionary by nature, a Protestant. Zhurlavyov came out boldly against the rich and would not put up with the slightest injustice. He was always traveling somewhere and shortly died from consumption. Another acquaintance of Ilyich's was a poor peasant with whom he often went out shooting. He was one of the simplest fellows, Sasipach. His name was. He thought a lot of Vladimir Ilyich and used to give him all kinds of odd presents. Once it was a live crane, once some cedar cones. Though Sasipach and Through Sasipach and Zhurlavyov, Vladimir Ilyich studied the Siberian village. He told me once of a talk he had with a well-to-do peasant in whose house he had lived. The man's farm laborer had stolen some hides from him. The peasant overtook him at the brook and finished him off. Ilyich, in this connection, spoke about the insensate cruelty of the petty proprietor and his ruthless exploitation of his farmhands. Indeed, the Siberian farm laborers worked like cart horses and never got enough sleep except on holidays. Vladimir Ilyich had another method of studying the village. On Sundays, he gave free legal advice. His reputation as a lawyer rose high after he helped a gold mine worker who had been given the sack to win his suit against his employer. The news of his success had spread quickly among the peasants, and men and women came to Ilyich with their troubles. He heard them out attentively, went deeply into the matter, and then gave his advice. Once a peasant came 20 versts to ask how he could prosecute his brother-in-law for not inviting him to his wedding, at which everyone had a good time. Will your brother-in-law treat you to a drink if you go and see him now? Aye, that he will. Vladimir Ilyich wasted an hour trying to persuade the fellow to make up with his brother-in-law. Sometimes you could not make head or tail of what they were talking about, and so Vladimir Ilyich always asked them to bring a copy of various papers in the case. Once, a bull belonging to a rich farmer gored a poor woman's cow. The Volast court ordered the owner to pay the woman 10 rubles. The woman refused to accept the decision and demanded a copy of all the evidence in the case. What do you want? A copy of the white cow? The assessor said, laughing at her. This enraged woman came running to Vladimir Ilyich. Sometimes it was enough for the wronged party to threaten to take his complaint to Vladimir Ilyich to make the offender give in. Vladimir Ilyich made a good study of the Siberian village. Till then he had known the Volga villages. He once told me, "My mother wanted me to go in for farming. I started, but then I saw it was no good. My relationships with the peasants became abnormal." Strictly speaking, Vladimir Ilyich had no right as an exile to handle legal affairs, but those were liberal times in Minusинsk. Practically, surveillance did not exist. The assessor, a local well-to-do peasant, was more concerned with selling us his veal than in seeing that his exiles did not run away. Life was surprisingly cheap in Shushenskaya. Vladimir Ilyitch's monthly allowance of 8 rubles procured him clean lodgings, meals, paid for laundry and mending, and even that was considered dear. True, the dinner and supper were simple enough meals. Once a week, a sheep would be slaughtered, and Vladimir Ilyitch would be fed with it day in, day out until all was gone. Then they would buy meat for a week, and the servant girl would chop it up for cutlets out in the yard in a trough used for preparing the cattle feed. These cutlets were fed to Vladimir Ilyitch for a whole week. But there was milk and cream enough for both Vladimir Ilyitch and his dog, a fine Gordon setter named Zhenka, whom he taught to retrieve and point and do all kinds of canine tricks. As the Zirnayevs, our landlord family, often had drinking parties at which men used to get drunk, and his home life was in many ways inconvenient, we shortly moved to another place, renting half a cottage with a vegetable garden for 4 rubles a month. We set up on our own. In the summer, it was impossible to get anyone to help around the house. My mother and I tackled the Russian stove between us. Sometimes I would knock over the dumpling soup with the oven fork and upset the dumplings all over the coals. But I got used to it in time. We had all kinds of stuff growing in the garden: cucumber, carrots, beetroots, pumpkins, and whatnot. I was very proud of my little vegetable garden. Vladimir Ilyitch and I had made an orchard in the yard, fetching hops from the woods for the purpose. In October, we got a girl help, a skinny lass of 13 with bony elbows named Pasha, who quickly took things in hand. I taught her to read and write, and she decorated the wall with specimens of my mother's instruction. Nieva, waste any tea? And kept a diary in which she made such as notes as, Oscar Enberg and Perminsky came. They sang Stump, and so did I. I remember how we celebrated the 1st of May. Perminsky called in the morning looking very festive in a clean collar and tie, and himself shining like a new penny. His mood quickly infected us, and all 3 went to Oscar Enberg, taking the dog Zhenka with us. Zhenka ran ahead, yapping joyfully. We walked along the bank of the river Shusha. The ice had been broken and was drifting down the stream. Zhenka waded into the icy water and defied the shaggy Shushenskaya watchdogs to follow his example. Oscar was excited at our coming. We all sat down in his room and began singing together.
Заветного праздника вестник, встречая московский рассвет, проносится песня над Красною Крестник, и масло повторит ответ. Это моя Москва, это ее весна, счастья и света полна, Москва, Москва, Москва. Это моя Москва, это ее весна, счастья и света полна, Москва, Москва.
Having sung the songs in Russian, we sang it in Polish and decided to celebrate May Day out in the fields after dinner. That is what we did. There were 6 of us in the field. Praminsky took his 2 little boys along with him. He was as radiant as ever. Stepping onto a dry mound in the field, Praminsky pulled a red handkerchief out of his pocket and laid it on the ground and stood on his head. The children squealed with delight. In the evening, we all got together at our place and sang songs again. Praminsky's wife came too. My mother and Pasha also joined in the chorus. That night, Ilyich and I could not fall asleep for thinking of the huge workers' demonstrations in which we would take part. There was a childish element too. A Lettish settler, Latvian, a felt boot maker by trade, lived across the way. He had 14 children, but only one survived, Minka. The father was an inveterate drunkard. Minka, who was 6, was grave of speech with a one little face and bright eyes. He came to see us every day. We would hardly be up when the door would bang and a small figure appear in a big cap and his mother's warm jacket with a scarf wrapped around him, exclaiming gladly, "It's me!" He knew my mother doted on him, and Vladimir Ilyich would always say something funny and play with him. Minka's mother would come running in. "Darling, have you seen a ruble lying about?" She said, "Yes, I saw it on the table, so I put it in the box." When we went away, Minka fell ill with grief. He is dead now. His father wrote asking to be given a bit of the land across the Yenisei, as I'd like to be able to have enough to eat in my old age. Our household kept on growing. Our latest acquisition was a kitten. First thing in the morning, Vladimir Ilyich and I would sit down to the web translation which Struve got for me. After dinner, we spent a couple of hours together copying out the development of capitalism. Then there were all kinds of odd jobs to do. One day, Patrisov sent us Kautsky's book criticizing Bernstein, which we were allowed to keep for no longer than a fortnight. We dropped everything else we were doing and translated it exactly on time. After work, we went out for walks. Vladimir Ilyich was a passionate hunter, and he got himself a pair of leather breeches and prowled about all the swamps in the neighborhood. They teemed with game, I must say. Arriving as I did in the spring, I had been rather surprised at it all. Praminsky would come in. He was passionately fond of hunting too, and say with a huge smile, "The ducks have come over and I have seen them." Then Oscar would come in, talking ducks. They would talk about them for hours, and the next spring found me too capable about talking about ducks, and who had seen them and where and when. Nature in the spring burst into riotous life after the winter frost. Her sway grew powerful. Sunset, wild swans swam in vast puddles which spring had formed in the fields. Or we would stand on the fringe of the woods listening to the babble of a brook and the mating call of a wood grouse. Vladimir Ilyich would ask me to hold Zhenka while he went into the woods. I would stand there holding a dog who trembled with excitement while I felt his tempestuous awakening of nature tingling in all my veins. Vladimir Ilyich was a passionate hunter, but apt to get too excited over it. In the autumn, we went far out into the forest cuttings. Vladimir Ilyich would say, "You know, if I come across a hare, I won't shoot it because I didn't bring my bags. It would be awkward to carry." Yet as soon as a hare came bounding out, he would let go at it. Late in autumn, when the sludge was already drifting down the Yenisei, we went out to the islands after the hares. The hares were already turning white. They could not escape from the island. I ran about like the goats. Our hunters would sometimes shoot a boatload of them. When we lived in Moscow, Vladimir Ilyich in his latter years would still go hunting sometimes, but with nothing like the old zest. Once a fox battue was organized, and Vladimir Ilyich was greatly interested in the enterprise. A clever idea, he said when he saw the strung flags. The beaters drove the fox straight towards him, but he seized the gun when it was too late. The fox stopped and looked at him and then slipped away into the woods. "Why didn't you shoot?" I asked him. "The fox was so beautiful," he said. Late in autumn, when the rivers had frozen over but no snow had fallen, we went far upstream. Every little fish and pebble could be seen distinctly under the ice. It was like an enchanted kingdom. In the winter, when the mercury freezes in the thermometers and the rivers freeze right through, the waters flow over the ice and quickly forms a frozen crust. You could skate a couple of miles on this sagging ice crust. Vladimir Ilyich was terribly fond of this sport. In the evening, Vladimir Ilyich usually read books on philosophy. Hegel, Kant, or French materialists, and when he grew tired, Pushkin, Lermontov, or Nekrasov. When Vladimir Ilyich first turned up in St. Petersburg, I had known him only from hearsay. Stepan Radchenko told me that he only read serious books and had never read a novel in his life. It had surprised me at that time. Afterwards, when I got to know him better, this question had somehow never come up. It was only in Siberia when I found that story was sheer invention. Vladimir Ilyich had not only read Turgenev, Tolstoy, and Chernyshevsky's What Is to Be Done, but reread them many times and was generally fond of the classics, which he knew intimately. Afterwards, when the Bolsheviks came to power, he set Gosizdat the task of reprinting the classics in cheap edition. His photo albums contain pictures of Zola and Herzen and several photos of Chernyshevsky, as well as photos of his relatives and old political convicts. Mail came in twice a week. Our correspondence was extensive. Anna Ilyinichna, Lenin's sister, wrote fully about everything from St. Petersburg. Nina Struve wrote me, by the way, that her baby boy was already holding his head up, and every day we showed him the portraits of Darwin and Marx and say, "Nod to Uncle Darwin and nod to Uncle Marx," and he nods in such an amusing way. We received letters from distant places of exile, from Martov in Turukhansk and from Patresov in Orlov, Vyatka gubernia. Most of the letters, however, were from comrades scattered throughout the neighboring villages. The Krznizhanovskys and Starkov wrote from Minusinsk, 50 versts from Shushenskaya. 30 versts away in Yermakovskup lived Lepeshensky, Vanev, Sylvan, and Panin. A latter, the friend of Oscar's. 70 versts away at Tess lived Legnik, Shavapol, and Baramzin, while Kurnatovsky lived at the sugar refinery. We corresponded on every possible topic: the Russian news, future plans, books, new trends, and philosophy. We corresponded also on chess problems, especially with Lepeshinsky. Vladimir Ilyich played games by correspondence. He would set out the figures and ponder over the board. He got so enthusiastic about it that he once cried out in his sleep, "If he moves his knight here, I'll put my rook there." Both Vladimir Ilyich and his brother Alexander had been enthusiastic chess players ever since they were children. Their father had played chess too. "Father used to beat us at first," Vladimir Ilyich once told me, "but then my brother and I got hold of a chess manual and started beating him. Once I met my father coming out of our room. It was upstairs with a lighted candle in one hand and the chess manual in the other. He made a study of it too." Vladimir Ilyich gave up chess when he returned to Russia. "Chess is too absorbing. It interferes with your work." As Vladimir Ilyich was incapable of doing anything by halves, he always gave himself up wholeheartedly to whatever he was doing. It was usually with a reluctance that he sat down to a game of chess when relaxing, or when he lived abroad as a political emigrant. Vladimir Ilyich, from his early youth, had a knack of being able to cast aside whatever interfered with his work. When I was a schoolboy, I went in for skating, but it made me tired and sleepy and interfered with my studies, so I gave it up, he said. One time, he related on another occasion, I was very keen on Latin. "Latin?" I asked, surprised. "But it interfered with my other studies, so I gave it up." Only recently, while reading an article in Leaf dealing with the style and sentence structure of Vladimir Ilyич's writings, which were said to resemble those of Roman orators, did I understand Vladimir Ilyич's interest in Latin writers. We not only corresponded with other comrades in exile, but sometimes, though not often, met them. Once we went to see Kurnatovsky. He was a good comrade and a highly educated Marxist, but life had dealt harshly with him. An unhappy childhood dominated by a cruel father, and then exile after exile, prison after prison. He had hardly ever done any work. After a month or two of freedom, he would be snatched back again for long terms. He never had any real life. One little incident stands out in my memory. We were passing the sugar refinery at which he was employed. Two girls were going along, the youngest quite a little one. The elder one was carrying the empty pail, the younger one a pail with beetroots. "Aren't you ashamed? A big girl like you making the little one carry things," Kurnatovsky said to the bigger girl. She just looked at him with a puzzled air. We also went to Tess.